During the season of Lent, we will be taking a look at the life of Paul. More than anyone else besides Jesus, Paul was responsible for the founding of the early church. He gives us about 1/3 of our New Testament. As the basis of these sermons, I'll be using Adam Hamilton's book, The Call, The Life and Message of the Apostle Paul. So let me begin by proposing a conundrum to you this morning. Does God give us various experiences to teach us in order to use us later? Or does God simply use the various experiences we have had in order to accomplish God's purposes? Now, while some of you think about that, and others of you simply say, who cares? Let me bore you with some thoughts about Tarsus. We'll show a map for you on the screens of where Tarsus is exactly. As you can see, Tarsus was just off the Mediterranean Sea, and the Tarsus Mountains were behind. We can pull up the next picture. The Cydnus River led to a harbor at the city of Tarsus. From Tarsus, there was an ancient highway that passed through the Cilician Gates, which is this picture, which back in Paul's day, of course, it did not have the road with the vehicles on it, but it was still the passageway in between these two gates, so to speak. Why is that important? Because of its geographical location, Tarsus was on a key east-west trade route, bringing goods from the east to the interior of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. This made it important to the Roman Empire. So in 64 BC, Rome conquered Tarsus. In order to have favor with the residents of Tarsus, Rome granted Roman citizenship to all of the landowners in Tarsus. However, the Roman favors didn't stop there. Tarsus was declared a free city, meaning that residents of Tarsus were exempt from paying any taxes. Can you imagine that? Could you imagine what would happen to Estherville if the United States made all residents of Estherville exempt from paying taxes? I think it would greatly increase the number of people who lived in Estherville, couldn't you? We would have to move the city limits out. But because of all of these things, Greek culture arrived in Tarsus. That culture included everything from the Greek Olympic-style games to Greek scholarship to Greek philosophy. Tarsus had the best that the Roman Empire had to offer. That is, the best outside of Rome itself. And to this place, somewhere between 5 BC and 10 AD, a Jewish baby boy was born of the tribe of Benjamin, and his parents named him after the first king of Israel. We simply know him as Saul of Tarsus. Since most boys learned the trade of their fathers during those days, and Saul was a tent maker, it takes no stretch of the imagination to think that Saul's parents, later he was called Paul, but we'll get to there, owned property and probably a business in tent making, which is how Saul became a Roman citizen. However, his parents wanted more for their son, a lot like parents today want more for their children. It wasn't enough for their boy Saul to be a tent maker. And so probably at the age of 13, Saul was sent to Jerusalem to study. He was to study under the noted Jewish scribe Gamaliel. After hearing all of this, do you remember the conundrum that I asked at the beginning of the sermon? I won't put anybody on the spot. But it was, does God give us various experiences to teach us in order to use us later, or does God simply use the various experiences we have had in order to accomplish God's purposes? Your answer to that question actually tells me about your theology. If you believe that God gives us various experiences to teach us, then you lean toward Calvinism or predestination. If you believe that God uses various experiences we have had, then you lean towards Arminianism humdrum probably either way, depending on what day it was of the week, rather than on a deep-seated theology or belief system that I hold. But in any case, whatever you answered, we can see from all the background information that I've given this morning how God uses the experiences of Saul to make Saul into Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles. However, I don't want this just to be a history lesson this morning. So what are the puzzle pieces? The life experiences that you have had that God might use to accomplish His redemptive work in the world. What life experiences have you had that God has used or can use to minister to others? Being a pastor's kid means that you move around a lot. We moved to Iowa when I was 11. I don't remember what year we moved to Iowa. And it was probably the 13th house I had lived in. And so there were several different churches in there, and then my junior high and high school years, there were two different churches, or two different appointments, I should say. There was more churches than that. But, churches have a different attitude. Some churches hear children, and the more ruckus they make, the better, because, that's who we are. In some churches, when children make noise, it's like, who did that? Somebody should correct that. And it's having those different life experiences of whether or not we're going to be reaching out to others in love, or if we're going to be judgmental towards them. Always being the new kid, or the newer kid in school. Because sometimes for the new kid in Iowa, it seems like you could have been here for 5 years. Sometimes you were always on the outside, looking in. I remember we moved to Cresco when I was going into 8th grade, and the previous pastor had 2 daughters. One that was my exact same age, and one that was a year or 2 older. But the friends who she was friends with would later become the friends that I was friends with. But during that first year, and this is probably why I dislike 8th graders, I don't really dislike you, I just dislike my 8th grade year. I should say that. Is because they were so mean. You want to pick one year that kids are the worst to each other? I think it's 8th grade. But then we went through high school together, and then we did become friends, and really good friends still to this day. But how are you going to act? Most people aren't going to stick around to see. And I think that experience has impacted how I am as a pastor. That I want everyone to feel the love of God. Lead them to God, to Jesus of the cross, and not out of judgment, but out of love. Out of love. What are the experiences that God can use from your past? What are those experiences to help you in your future ministry? Let's go back to Saul. Saul was probably in Jerusalem during the events of Holy Week and Pentecost. As the followers of the way began to grow in number, Saul would have seen more and more of his Jewish brothers and sisters leaving the faith of his youth. When Stephen became the first martyr of this young movement, we know that from Acts chapter 7, verse 58, that they laid their coats at the feet of Saul. There are some biblical scholars who suggest that this means that Saul was sent to supervise the stoning. Can you imagine that? He was an active participant in this stoning by that action, not just a passive spectator. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belongs to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Doesn't that seem a little much to you? Maybe a little overreaction? Hamilton writes, early in his career, Paul was eager to impress the Jewish ruling council in Jerusalem and to make a name for himself. In other words, it was Paul's personal ambition, combined with his unwavering religious convictions, that I believe led him to the work of persecuting the fledgling Christian movement. When does your ambition let you get in the way? Let me add here that I don't think that anything is wrong with ambition. Ambition has been defined as a strong desire to do or to achieve something, typically requiring determination and hard work. Nothing is wrong with that. However, let me suggest that it's important for us to submit our ambition to God, directing it to God's glory, not our own. How can we further the kingdom of God? By our actions. So let me ask, what is God asking us to do to bring honor and glory to Him? I believe God is still in the business of calling men and women, boys and girls to do great things for Him. So what is it that God is asking you to do for Him? Don't think too small. We serve a great and mighty God. Let us not be guilty of having too little ambition for God or too much for ourselves. As we return to Saul's story, it is the part of this story, or of his story, that we know the best. Paul is on his way to Damascus when he is blinded by a bright light. And Paul tells of his experience in Acts chapter 26 this way. When we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads. Now, for most of us, we probably have no idea what a goad is. Are you in that part with me? Yeah. But a goad was used to keep oxen going in the direction that you wanted them to go. If they were veering off to the right, you poked them on the right flank, which caused them to go back to the left. However, sometimes an ox didn't like to be poked, and so they would kick backwards at their owner or guide. And as the ox would get ready to kick, the owner or guide would place the point of the goad behind their leg so that when they kicked, they would get stuck. And soon, they would learn to stop kicking because it hurt them. That is the lesson that Paul was to learn. Remember, it said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads. He needed to learn that to fight against or to resist Jesus' plans and guidance only hurts us. God will find a way, but it hurts us not to do God's will. Saul gets up and he goes on to Damascus, but he could not see, and so for 3 days he does not eat and he does not drink. He prays and he waits. He is waiting for a man named Ananias, but Ananias has heard of Saul. Could you imagine being Ananias? You know all the bad things that Saul has done and what he's trying to do or said he was trying to do. And so he doesn't want to go. But Jesus says to Ananias, go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. I myself will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. Remember in the beginning of this sermon, Saul was born into a Greek and Roman culture. He was the son of a Jewish couple. He had just the background that God could use to reach all people, Gentiles and Jews. He understood both ways of life, but we'll have more to say about that in the coming weeks. Today, I simply want to wrap this up by saying that God knows each and every one of us. He knows each and every one of us by name and knew us before we were formed. God knows what makes us who we are. God only calls us to follow Christ. Paul wasn't called to be like Peter, and Peter certainly was not called to be like Paul, but they were both called to follow Christ. Today, I've asked us to consider those experiences that we have had in our lives that God can use to fulfill His purposes. I've asked us whether or not we have submitted our ambitions to God to bring honor and glory to Him. All of this is only important if we follow Christ. So are you following Christ this morning? Let us pray. Lord Jesus, we commit ourselves to you this day. Take us, accept us, use us as you will.